Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Erin Joe, a senior executive for cybersecurity and readiness in the office of the CISO at Google Cloud. Erin, thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Obviously, this is as it always is, a very important time to be talking about cyber threats and what we're seeing out there on the internet and in the digital landscape. There's so much going on, especially since the SolarWinds attack in terms of the software supply chain.
Okay.
What have we seen and learned, do you think, over the last few years from some of these supply chain types attacks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that attack did open our eyes to what was happening in our supply chain, or in the things in our digital supply chain. So I like to think about these in two buckets. One are the threat actors' use of exploits against things in our everyday digital supply chain. And then the second is when threat actors actually implant malicious code into the products themselves. And that is a more clear example of a direct supply chain attack. But both are really important for our discussion today. And a good example, even though some of these examples are starting to get a little dated, we've learned a lot from them. So I really like to share those learnings. The first example I want to talk about is Barracuda and the email security gateway, where China Nexus espionage threat actors sent emails with malicious files attached that allow them to get access. And the five things that I think are really fascinating from that example are: one, they also sent emails of poor quality. And that deters investigation because you think they're getting caught by spam filters. We saw this in this case and in other cases. The second is they used three malware families that masqueraded as legitimate. This is showing us how well adapted our threat actors are in the environment, because now they not only can live off the land and go undetected, but now bring in malicious code into the environment and go undetected. The third is that they stage data in temp files and leverage open SSLs to move large volumes of data. This may present us with an opportunity for detection. So I know that organizations move large volumes of data all the time, but we really want to be challenging those times when large volumes of data are being staged and being leveraged, for an exfiltration. The fourth thing is the threat actors reacted. So no longer is incident response a game of cat and mouse, right? It's a game of chess. These threat actors, they didn't just run away when incident responders came in. Instead, they had prepared for it. So when incident response began, they were already aware of it. They were ready for it. They began changing their tactics, deleting evidence, putting information into the environment to throw investigators off. So this was actually an interactive exchange. So this is a very different way of interaction, of having interaction between incident responders and our threat actors. And the fifth thing is, the threat actors have studied all of our response, not just the incident response in the environment, but everything that happens thereafter. So the threat actors know that we're going to, or that the manufacturers are going to issue either new versions of the software or new software or hardware. So the threat actors hid the malware intended to install the backdoor in the configuration files. Therefore, when the new software and hardware were issued, it just reinstalls the backdoor again. So those are really extensive learnings from just one example. The other thing I'll mention today that I think is also helpful is the MoveIt case. There we saw financially motivated criminal threat actors using zero-day exploits to get access into open instances. And the reason this one is so important for us to examine is, one, it tells us we need to monitor shaming sites, because that's how most of the victims found out that they had been victimized. And the second is, it really illustrates the necessity for good data governance. Because if the data weren't there, if we were cleaning up old data and making sure that old data gets erased, it wouldn't be there for the threat actors to gain access into. And the third one is the true supply chain type of attack. And that is where North Korean financially motivated threat actors implanted malware into trading software. And 3CX has said that one of their employees downloaded that software onto a personal computer. And that personal computer was used then to access the build environment of 3CX, where the threat actors were able to leverage that access and take an opportunistic moment, get into that build environment and install malware into the product, such that when it was downloaded by their customers were starting to see evidence of a compromise. So that is a very sophisticated, multi-level type of an attack in the actual supply chain itself. And I think a few things come from that. One is it really highlights why we're going to things like SBOMs, software bill of materials, why we're starting to scrutinize the products themselves, and how we need to, just like in the SolarWinds case, make sure that we're continually validating everything that's happening, not just at the time of production, not just at the time of installation, but on an ongoing basis. And then last, it just really emphasizes the need for a zero trust environment and areas where we can improve.
Yeah, I think you really laid out how savvy these attacks are really becoming. And at the same time, obviously, the federal government is responding through, President Joe Biden's executive cybersecurity executive order with things that you mentioned, like SBOMs, zero trust architectures, trying to kind of meet the attackers, keep pace with them. But where are things going, do you think? What are some of the
Yeah.
sort of emerging threats and trends in the future with what you've just said in mind?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I had a long career in government, and I'm really grateful to see how much government activity there is in this space. And I think we will continue to see more just out of necessity. And the emerging trends that I see, I'll just mention three. One is I think the continued use of exploits and 0 days and attacks on our digital supply chain. So last year alone, we saw over 90 0 days being used. And that's from a mandate perspective of the incidents that we're in. We also will continue to see supply chain type of attacks, and they have been in our security appliances. The very things that we're telling people to use for security are the very areas where our threat actors are going, and not only there, but also on the edge devices where they're not protected by endpoint detection and response. So those are some areas where we really need to have that additional focus, like the SBOMs and other types of, like the pledge from CISA for Secure by Design, which we've signed, as have many others. Customer demand, I think, is really important here. Just as in the auto industry, when we started with seatbelts and then we ended up with safety features, right? There's been a huge evolution, both from legal and policy as well as practice, just in individual consumer expectation of safety and security in our auto industry. I think we will start to see that even more with increasing demand for security in the products. And then another area is aggressive tactics are likely to continue. So in 2023, we saw about 40% of the time the threat actors took the time to access data. So we know that they have a preference in certain cases to access data to continue that extortion. So that extortion is another level of aggression. And about half of all attacks that we saw, and about 70% of the ransomware attacks that we saw, the victims were notified by a third party. So we're seeing that these tactics are very good, and they're able to exist in your environment for a period of time before they then leverage another additional layer of attack. And about 27% of the times we saw multiple threat actors in single victim environments, and about 40% of the time we find malware intended to leave a backdoor. So that backdoor capability, right? These are levels of aggression, again, against the victim. So it's not just getting in and leaving, not just getting in and doing an attack, but really aiming for that persistence and also supporting others who may also want access into that same environment. And from the Russia perspective, we continue to see new types of destructive malware, multiple types of OT or operational technology focused malware coming out from that region. We continue to see China not only conducting a lot of the espionage that we are used to seeing them conduct, but now also seeing them really targeting our critical infrastructure, and with some of their threat actors even using botnets to obfuscate command and control. Iran, right? We've seen the healthcare industry being affected, government targeting, but also targeting of logistics and transportation, and their increasing aggressiveness, even being attributed to a website that threatened election officials. And then from a criminal perspective, Scattered Spider, Luna Tempest, these are groups that we track. They're known by other names throughout the industry, but they are well known. And from a criminal perspective, we see them really targeting the individuals, not just the corporations or organizations, but taking information and using it directly against an individual, or even reaching out to families, reaching out to the children of a particular executive, sending flowers to the wife of some of the employees, contacting customers and pressuring the customers to have the victim pay a ransom, and also reaching out to the SEC. Some of these organizations have actually reached out to the SEC because they know that there are reporting requirements, and they're actually reporting a significant breach to the SEC and saying, hey, they haven't reported it yet, even though we've conducted an attack. So there's these layers of aggression that we continue to see evolving. And the last thing I'll mention is, of course, AI. Right? Everybody's talking about it. We can't get through anything related to cybersecurity right now without talking about AI. But there's good news and bad news, right? So the good news is we are using AI for security, as are many in the industry. And this is a really important development. I mean, Google's used it for many, many years, but it's really starting to take hold in a number of ways. So not only do we use it and we've used it for a long time to protect Gmail, YouTube, search, all those things that so many people around the world use, but we've also infused it into security products. And I think you will continue to see more of that in the industry. We've also partnered with DARPA, and we are using AI to detect vulnerabilities in open source software. So I think you'll continue to see other researchers and others in the industry do that. So hopefully we're detecting those vulnerabilities before the threat actors are. But the bad news, right, is that it is accessible in use by the threat actors, and it will accelerate their ability to use their tactics, techniques, and procedures to create more credible information operations, social engineering, personas, foster code creation, vulnerability detection, and the like. So I think it's going to cut both ways.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the sort of aggressiveness that you mentioned from these attackers is really ramping up to beyond something just as simple as data exfiltration and privacy, but to these impacts on critical infrastructure, to ransomware attacks that could shut down your business or your hospital or what have you. You mentioned earlier in the conversation there are some emerging techniques to be better prepared and be better prepared to potentially detect some of these evolving threats, things like large volumes of data being staged in your environment. How can organizations just better stay ahead of some of these threats and at least be prepared to detect and respond and potentially recover once they get hit?
Right. Yeah, I think there are three main strategies to address that: risk, readiness, and resilience. And one is the intelligence itself. How will you know? How will you know when there's a new attack type? How will you get that intelligence? We look to government to piece that together and get the holistic view of the threat. And they are uniquely positioned to do that, even though so much of that intelligence does reside and lie in the private sector. A lot of that intelligence is available. So we are really looking to government to piece those things together for us. But then we're also turning to industry and saying, hey, industry, when you see something, we have to get that information out as quickly as possible. But then also those on the receiving end, the consumer side, need to be positioned to receive it. As we saw in the Snowflake case, Snowflake and Mandiant put out a lot of information because it was the result of a credential theft on the customer side. But it took customers a while to get that information and to implement it. So you have to really position yourself to get the right intelligence and be able to implement it. The second strategy, I think, is related to that detection and response, because there's so much technology and automation coming out that we can make better use of our precious resources, our people. And we're continually improving in these areas. And like I said, even applying AI into detection and response. So thinking about how quickly can you take the information, apply it, and then also apply lessons learned. So do you have access to that frontline intelligence? Are you able to automate responses and operate at the speed of cyber, where your people can then be used for the things that you need the humans to do? And the last part of the strategy, I think, is looking at areas where you can reduce impact. So again, we've talked about data governance, right? Good data discipline is really important, because if the data is not there, then the threat actors can't access it. Another one is that zero trust architecture. I mean, this is a really important movement in government, and it gained a lot of strength and attention early on, and I hope that momentum continues. Google implemented one of the largest zero trust enterprises on the planet. So it can be done, but it is, of course, very challenging. So I think the key there is start somewhere. Right? There are places like browsers where a lot of activity is happening, and you can stop a lot of threat activity in the browser. And with all the bring your own devices, work at home, remote work, the browser is a really good place to start to implement a zero trust strategy, and then you can go from there. But if you never start somewhere, you never get started, right? You have to have a strategy for that and begin to take steps. And the last thing I'll mention is I talk to a lot of customers on the commercial side. And when I was in government, I talked to the commercial sector quite often. But now your audience, right? A great government audience here. And I think it's really important to think about building that community and partnership with those who can take you into the future. And we certainly encourage customers, and we ourselves work very closely with government, but we also want to see government working really closely with industry, because there's a lot that we can do and a lot that we can share and how we can progress. We've seen the benefit of sharing information about the malicious activity. We saw the benefit of when KnowBe4, when they disclosed that they had hired a North Korean IT worker, right? That also notified and let others know, hey, we may have done the same thing. And in fact, many had. So sharing of that information is really important. And that two-way sharing is really critical. And the last thing I'll mention is really going into that space of modernization. You know, sometimes there are areas where government is ahead, and sometimes there are areas where the commercial side or industry is ahead. But I think everyone is looking at how can I modernize my security posture? And there's a lot being done in this area where we can help and bring technology into that space, and again, make better use of our resources.
All right, some really great considerations there. Again, I'd like to thank today's guest, Erin Joe. She's a senior executive for cybersecurity and readiness in the office of the CISO at Google Cloud. Erin, thanks again.
Thank you.
And again, I'm Justin Doubleday. You're watching Federal News Network. Let me send you back to the studio for more on the Cyber Leaders Exchange.